Okay, part 3. Rest in peace, journalism. We're continuing our list of the rewriting of history. Thanks to the left-wing media and its bad works over the last century, which has been seeped down into our culture. We're on the 11th example of the rewriting of history from something true into something false, taught and in schools today, in many cases, and purveyed by journalism and journalists today, quite often. Number 11, Constitution. The Constitution, a living, breathing document. This lie has been one of the more common things heard by people who just simply think that believe quietly amongst themselves and others of their ilk that the Constitution is an obstacle to getting away with the crap they want to get away with. So rather than actually conform to the Constitution, they just decide that the Constitution is no longer viable. Or, if it's not obsolete, it's living and breathing, meaning that the Constitution and its interpretation was always meant to be reinterpreted by a new society. As society changes, so does the meaning Constitution, living and breathing. And nothing could be further from the truth. The Constitution was never meant to be done that way, and in fact, almost all of the Constitution, if not all of the Constitution, still applies today. It's a matter of wanting to adhere. As soon as they don't, lefties in the Democrat Party and in journalism will find 1,000 ways to work around the Constitution. And one of those workarounds was putting out the lie that the Constitution was and is a living, breathing document. 12. Lincoln didn't believe in abolition until his presidency. Baloney. He wrote extensively as a lawyer about abolition. He took multiple trips down the Mississippi when he was young to New Orleans, where he first encountered slavery and found it absolutely abhorrent, and he wrote about it. He was an abolitionist from the word go. And it is provable, documented, and knowable. Anybody who says otherwise doesn't know their history or has an agenda. 13. President Clinton was impeached over having sex. Wrong. My last video, which was about the Clinton crime family, shows and reminds us, without a shadow of a doubt, that Clinton was impeached by the House for high crimes and misdemeanors, one of which was perjuring himself under oath in a civil lawsuit. What he perjured about was the sex, but it had nothing to do with it. He could have perjured about his dog. He could have perjured to the grand jury about anything. It didn't matter what he perjured. The fact is, he lied under oath to a grand jury. Period. That's a high crime misdemeanor. That's an impeachable offense. 14. George W. Bush stole the 2000 election. As I mentioned, a lot of the crap that we've been getting from the Democrats has to do with the spiteful nature they have as a result of losing that election because it was so close. George W. Bush stole nothing. Recount after recount after recount, most of which were conducted by liberals and Democrats, every single one found that George Bush won Florida and therefore the 2000 election. He stole nothing. Period. 15. We are not in a war on terror. Well, this lie has been conducted by people who don't like war. They don't like fighting. They don't like America. They don't like all sorts of things. But we have actually been in a war, as I mentioned, time and time again, with terrorism. As long as they're in a war with us, we're in a war with them. Whether we're fighting them or not is Beside the point. If one side's warring against you, guess what? You're in a war. And that war's been going on in its current state since at least 1979, the Iran hostage crisis. That's a long war to ignore. 16. Native Americans were all peace-loving, and only whites killed off the buffalo, and Republicans lied to the Indians. So basically we're talking about the whole 19th century Indian white guy conflict that was going on in America. Well, let's tackle this one at a time. First of all, long before white people settled in North America, Indians have been killing each other like warring tribes going back thousands and thousands of years. There were peaceful tribes, and there were warrior tribes, and there were conqueror tribes. There were Indians that literally feared for their lives against other tribes. And this didn't just end when the white guys came and they all became peace-loving and unified. No, this went on all throughout the rest of the 19th century. The second part of this is that only whites killed off the buffalo. No. They had a hand in it, but many Indian tribes killed off a lot of the buffalo, if not all, in their areas. The whites weren't everywhere yet. They were still moving west. But a lot of the buffalo tribes were actually killed off by Indians themselves. But the most important one of this one, I think, is Republicans lied to the Indians. No. That's not to say that Republicans never lied to the Indians. They might have later, but not as often and nowhere near as egregiously as Democrats did. As I mentioned in my History of the Democrat Party video, the Republicans didn't even exist until 1854. But there had been a lot, and I mean a lot, of history between white people and Indians prior to 1854. The Trail of Tears, for instance, was under Andrew Jackson's presidency, a Democrat. And most of the land-grabbing, treaty-breaking, Indian relocating crap that occurred in this country were conducted under the Democrat Party and their government that lasted, remember, from 1820 all the way to 1854. They were in complete control of everything for 30 years. And that's when a majority of this shit happened. Now, did some of it happen after? Yeah, but there were some Democrats that happened, presidencies that occurred after the Civil War here and again. And a lot of that stuff happened again under their presidencies too. Lie number 78, or rewriting of history number 17, sorry. Thanksgiving commemorates Indians helping hapless colonists who were all racists. A year or so ago, no, it was probably a year and a half ago, there was this big to-do in, I want to say either Montana or North Dakota, regarding the new pipeline that we were wanting, we meaning conservatives and Republicans, were wanting to have come down from Canada to add to our energy source resources and independence from Europe and all that. And the liberals were not having it. And the liberals decided to go up to the cold, barren regions of this area of the country and protest, along with many Indians who, of course, also left the reservation, if you will, in terms of truth and historically as well, and go up there and cause all sorts of problems and try to halt this pipeline from going through what was considered to be sacred Indian land. and that somehow no compromise would ever be considered to go around the land. It turned out, of course, to be bogus, that the compromises were to do so were actually offered and turned down by the Indians a dozen different times. And so when it finally came push to shove and we just went ahead, that's when the protests occurred. And then there was this one glittering jewel of colossal ignorance from Hollywood by the name of Shailene Woodley of the Divergent movies, who got on camera one day and for all to see glorified her ignorance in a mind-numbing, spellboundingly stupid rant about how we have been doing this to the Indians since the days of the first Thanksgiving, when we started to conquer, destroy, and ruin all of the Indians in the United States, or something to that effect. My jaw dropped. I could not believe what I heard. She just condemned Thanksgiving now, and a lot of people have as well. In textbooks, they have been changing the definition of Thanksgiving, the meaning and its history, going back decades now. But to hear some supposedly school-taught, intelligent human being turn it into some kind of Thanksgiving massacre that occurred, that was a new one on me. They will stoop at anything to try to get their point of view across, even if it means rewriting history. First of all, nobody conquered anybody during the time of Thanksgiving. Nobody killed anybody during the times of Thanksgiving. The Indians that had met with the colonists were peace-loving as the colonists were. These were Puritans, pilgrims, but Puritans, who were strict, Bible-worshipping, peace-loving, God-fearing people. They had their quirks and their idiosyncrasies and their problems, but among them were not killing innocent Indians. Never happened. These people also came from modest means. Many of them were farmers, carpenters, people who knew how to fish, plant, and all sorts of things. They already knew how to do this stuff. All the Indians did to help them was to make them aware of the type of game and fish and conditions that they were going to encounter in the New World that may not have been the way it was in the Old World. They didn't have to teach them how to fish. They teach them what fish to fish for. They didn't have to teach them how to grow plants. They taught them which plants to grow and how they grew. They helped them. They weren't completely dependent on the Indians. In fact, after Thanksgiving, the cornucopia of harvest that the colonists created actually helped feed the Indians. It worked both ways. They had trading posts with Indians to trade and sell goods. It was a win-win. The history of Thanksgiving was one of free markets, capitalism, and getting along with natives. Not killing them or starting wars with them or lying to them or cheating them or whatever, as this idiot got on the television to tell everybody about. 18. Obamacare is working. Do I really have to explain this one? I don't think so. That's just an out-and-out lie. It is not working. In no way is it working. 19. Tax cuts only help the rich and hurt the poor, and Keynesian economics is correct. Well, we've discussed this also many times. Going back to the time of Lincoln and maybe even before that, Lincoln himself said, you cannot help the poor by hurting the rich. You cannot tax yourself into prosperity. You cannot. How many 100 different ways can this be explained? Well, John Maynard Keynes, the author, if you will, of Keynesian economics, taught the entire country that the economy should be thought of as a pie, sliced up numerous ways to benefit the economy in different areas. And when a rich person, or a person, and it doesn't matter who he is, takes a slice of the pie for themselves, that's one less piece of pie for somebody else. To the extent that people who are rich take all the slices, the people who are poor are without any slices. And this is how economics was thought of during the progressive movement of the early 20th century. Unfortunately, even though it's been debunked 1,000 ways from Sunday by great economists such as Milton Friedman, Thomas Sowell, and on and on and on, they still teach this crap in colleges and high schools. Keynesian economics. That the rich get rich on the backs of the poor, and it is absolutely baloney. The pie, as Keynes tried to explain, grows and shrinks with the economy. When it's growing, you can take as many pieces of pie you want to whoever wants it. There's still a growing pie that adds slices, and those added slices could be given to people less fortunate. Whether it does or not has nothing to do with whether the rich get theirs or not. It has to do with who's running where the money goes. Lie number 20. FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, for those of you in California, California schools, I don't know, helped end the Great Depression. Wrong. Franklin Delano Roosevelt is often considered to be the guy who ended the Great Depression, but actually he had nothing to do with it. And to be more fair with history, he actually made it worse. Because one, John Maynard Keynes was his favorite economist, and the things he did with the New Deal, which expanded government beyond its means, and the New Deal created more departments and grew government so far and above beyond what the founders of this country ever envisioned that it could not sustain itself. All those new works projects didn't result in a whole lot of new works. And all it did do is make a Great Depression last 25 years. The last red cent was finally paid off in 1954. Most people don't realize how long the Great Depression physically lasted on the ledgers of the United States, in the United States. But it lasted 25 years. It should have lasted, according to most experts, no more than 6 years. But because of the great works of Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his New Deal, he blew it out to 25 years. And the only reason that most Americans stopped feeling the major pinch of the Depression was because we got involved in arms sales to Britain in 1940 and later got into the war. They say war is life, but it also usually helps an economy because it gets people to work to build the war machine. And then, of course, the paying back of all the stuff we did for Japan and for Europe and all this other stuff into our coffers didn't hurt either. 21. Democrats are responsible for Civil Rights Act. So wrong. So badly wrong. There were many attempts prior to 1964, in the 50s and early 60s, to get a Civil Rights Act passed. During the time of Eisenhower's administration, sponsored by Republicans. This is part of the great lie, or the big switch that I was telling you about earlier. Sponsored by Republicans. And they were fought at every turn by Democrats who want to make sure that Eisenhower did not have a majority in the Congress. Only his first term had, or his middle part of his presidency had everybody Republican in all three branches of government. But in the latter part, the Democrats took over again. And bigots, racists like William J. Fulbright, who was Clinton's mentor, Al Gore Sr., Al Gore's father, and Robert Byrd, Grand Kleagle of the KKK, who became a congressman, these people made it impossible, and their ilk, to pass a civil rights law. Even Lyndon Johnson was against a Civil Rights Act in the 50s, and he only changed when he saw the writing on the wall and his future, for his future. More Republicans as a percentage voted for the Civil Rights Act in 1964 than Democrats did. It couldn't have passed without us. That is the truth. 22. Reagan is the cause of massive deficits in the 1980s. Well, we'll talk about this and one other issue before we get into some more statistical proof that journalism is indeed in the next part.